MSNBC White House correspondent Akayla Gardner is still standing by with us. Democratic Congressman from Texas, Joaquin Castro, also joins me here on set. He serves on the House Intel and Foreign Affairs committees, making him perfectly primed for this moment, although it's not what we plan to talk about. Akayla, first to you. I heard from the vice president there striking a very confident tone, optimism around the ceasefire, despite the fact that it has been under strain in recent days and weeks. But I heard him say there that they are focused on the future. Another note that I took down was that he refused to put an explicit deadline on the question of how long Hamas will have to return the remains of deceased Israeli hostages. This is one of the sticking points, of course, for the Israelis here. What else stood out to you, Akayla, as you were listening to the vice president there?
Yeah, Ali, I heard a lot of the same. This tough talk that we heard from the vice president, that has really been his style. He's been somewhat of a bulldog for the president and this administration. He said all parties involved have reasons to point fingers at each other, but he wants, as you said, everyone to focus on the future. He said that's going to involve constant monitoring, and he spoke about the center that the U.S. is standing up there to oversee this deal. And he plainly laid out that a lot of these hostages are buried under rubble. We should note that that was known before this hostage and prisoner exchange deal was struck, that not all of the remains would be returned. That is something that Vice President himself telegraphed, I recall, on a Sunday show the day before this deal.
Yeah.
And you also have this point of tension with Israel, that they need to be surging humanitarian aid into Palestine. There's questions about whether Israel is doing everything they can to do that. But the vice president has said in the past, when it comes to Hamas, that there are these different factions within this designated terrorist group by the U.S. and, frankly, most of the Western world. And they aren't sure whether the violations that we've seen has been something that was authorized by Hamas leadership. Hamas leadership says that they are not involved. But he also reiterated some of the president's threats. He said that there will be bad things, quote, that happen if Hamas does not agree to their side of the deal. So a lot of tough talk from the vice president today.
Yeah, tough talk, optimistic talk. And I think the White House is really leaning on that idea of different factions within Hamas to blame the violence that could be a potential violation in this ceasefire on those factions and not Hamas leadership. That's, I think, a key point here that we heard the vice president reiterate, especially when he talked about warning Hamas that they must, in his words, disarm, behave, and not kill the Palestinian people. Akayla Gardner is setting the scene for us as we dig in with Congressman Castro here. Thank you. So, Congressman, I was specifically struck, I think, by the way that the vice president both didn't put an explicit deadline on the return of the Israeli hostages' remains, but then also urging all parties to be flexible and the Israelis to exercise patience. What do you think that message is going to feel like from the Israelis receiving it right now?
Yeah. Well, first, I have strong disagreements with President Trump and J.D. Vance on many issues, including the fact that they won't negotiate in the same way or spend as much time on opening up the American government right now. But I'm glad that they used the leverage of the American government to reach a ceasefire agreement. Unfortunately, that ceasefire agreement has been broken now. And so I hope that the visit by J.D. Vance will get us back on track.
So you see this as broken? I just want to establish.
I think it's clear from all the reporting and what we've seen that, unfortunately, the ceasefire agreement has been broken. Now, we're still in the early days of it. So I hope that his presence there, that the negotiations will get it back on track, that people will stop dying. Americans in the world watched, first, a horrible attack, terrorist attack on October 7th. I think at that point, the world stood with Israel. But then we watched essentially an ethnic cleansing happen. And you watched tens of thousands, if not more, Palestinians, many of them innocent women and children, being killed by Israel. And so we wanted for that to stop. That's what the ceasefire represents to me. Look, you're dealing with two very difficult sides, and these tensions have been going on for a long time. But even the present characters, the United States government has deemed Hamas a terrorist organization. But I have said, even in the Foreign Affairs Committee, we've deemed them a terrorist organization. We've sanctioned them. We've punished anybody that does any kind of work or business with them. But what have we done to keep Benjamin Netanyahu in line? What have we done for somebody who's been declared a war criminal to make sure he understands that the American government is not going to give him carte blanche to do whatever he wants to do? And when I hear J.D. Vance, I'm glad he's there. I'm glad he's working on peace. But what I keep hearing is this pressure on one side and this threat of extermination against one side. Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government have to understand that the American people and the American government are not going to back them up no matter what they do. And that has to be made clear.
And yet we have heard from other world leaders the repeated point that President Trump is able to exercise some leverage over Netanyahu that others have not been able to in the past, the way that their long relationship might have actually manifested in this initial phase of the ceasefire, whether or not it can be gotten back on track. I have one more question on this before we pivot to the matters that you were originally here to discuss, which is the government shutdown. But when J.D. Vance talked about here the governing structure in Gaza and the way that he talked about not knowing what role Hamas would play, the fact that Hamas is supposed to disarm and actually not be part of any governing structure there. But how can you talk about, and how can he talk about a phase 2 here when there's not even really a plan? I mean, he talked about this as being a good problem to have, I guess insinuating that they were able to lay a foundation where they could start building more on what these diplomatic talks could look like. But how do you talk about a phase 2 when you don't even know who's going to be leading?
I think that's a fair question, and I think that, for years you've had the Palestinian Authority and Hamas who have controlled different parts, and even Benjamin Netanyahu essentially continued that separation because he didn't want a united government for Palestinians. And you also have in Hamas a group that has been very brutal, even with its own people, in the last several days. And so you do need it's not going to be an easy thing for these folks. And it's very tough. It's very complicated. But they've got to be able to get in there and negotiate all those things. And you have to have both sides that want the killing to stop and actually want peace. We have to be able to accomplish. Look, I mean, I think if it's still possible, a Palestinian state. And there has to be safety and peace for both Israelis and Palestinians.
And we haven't heard a ton of clarity from the administration when it comes to the idea of a two-state solution, but certainly for Trump, it's coming, these negotiations, against the backdrop of other countries like Britain, like Canada, France, all of them saying that they would recognize a Palestinian state. So, of course, we're going to keep our eyes squarely focused on what's happening in the region as the vice president continues his trip there and more diplomatic efforts occur. But I want to turn now back here at home, and you mentioned this, the fact that the government shutdown is officially now on day 21, stretching into historic territory, not the kind that I prefer you guys to be making, quite frankly. But what do you make of where things stand right now? And this is pretty squarely a Senate story, but the fact that Jeffries and Johnson don't seem to be talking to each other, they are talking past each other. What does that tell you about the way that this is going to go forward?
Well, that's why I said, I'm glad the vice president is there and trying to make sure this ceasefire gets back on track. But it's that kind of effort that the White House needs when it comes to reopening the American government. And they've refused to do it. Donald Trump instead is focused on tearing down part of the White House to spend millions of dollars on a ballroom, is talking about sending billions of dollars to Argentina and bailing out Argentina, and refuses to even talk about reopening the American government. And I'll tell you, Ali, I'm concerned about two things. One, we've talked about a lot, which is there really right now is a kind of cover-up going on. Adelita Grijalva is the 218th signature to force a vote on complete release of the Epstein files. And Donald Trump and many Republicans, and quite honestly, probably many of those donors and others, are deathly afraid of that. And let me be clear about something. When those files are released eventually, anybody who did illegal activities, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, should be held accountable. Their party shouldn't matter. And I think that everybody that I've spoken to among the Democratic Party believes that. Really, it shouldn't matter. If they did something wrong, they ought to be held accountable. But there is an active cover-up to not release those files. But the second thing, I think, is even more egregious long-term, and it's this, that by shutting down the House of Representatives, this is another way for the Speaker to essentially or functionally relinquish control to Donald Trump. The Congress basically is a bystander in American government right now. And Rand Paul said it the other day. He said that the Congress has taken itself out of the equation. This, I think, by keeping the government shut down, they're essentially giving all of these powers to Donald Trump.
Yeah, and what Paul was talking about there in that Meet the Press interview was the way that there has been minimal oversight and information flow from the White House to Congress when it comes to striking these alleged drug smuggling boats in Venezuela and Colombia. That's a larger question, right? I mean, congressional oversight is so central. You're
They're
on
letting
those
him do what he
committees.
wants.
And I think that is probably one of the larger threads that we've followed out of this Congress, whether it's on authorizations of military force, whether it's on appropriations and basic funding. Now, of course, we're looking at the swearing in of this Congresswoman-elect. I think all of that very much swirls in the mix. It's why this shutdown feels so complicated, so weird, unlike things that I've covered when I've covered shutdowns in this building. I thank you for coming on and sort of wrapping all of those threads together for us. Congressman Joaquin Castro,
Good to be with
Texas,
you.
thank you so much.